Welcome, everybody, to the 2023 Education and Development Career Panel. This is our second of two career panels this year. I'm really excited to have a diverse and wonderful group of panelists join us today. This is an event put on by the Comparative Education and International Development Community, or the CEID Community, at Moray House Education and Sport at the University of Edinburgh. My name is Will Smith. I am the CEID Community Coordinator and the Program Director for our Masters in Comparative Ed and International Development. So really excited to have everybody here today. If you're following along, please tweet about the event or connect with us at Moray House CEID. So the aim of our panel today is to really expose students and other interested individuals to the wide variety of work in education and development being done by those currently positioned in international or regional organizations. So really, when I hear from my students, a lot of the times they don't know what the next opportunities are, and the hope is that these panels really do kind of illustrate the diversity of future careers in this field. The panels are here to provide a space for panelists to share their career journey, advice, and challenges, but also for students and others to ask questions related to the current occupation, career path, to those experts that are working in the field. So I have individuals from at least 8 countries registered today, so I think we'll have potentially for a lot of interesting, diverse conversations going on. Our panel structure is pretty simple. I've asked each panelist to share for about 7 minutes and suggested they talk about their current position and their career journey. The panelists are all at different spots of their career journey, and so sometimes the highlight edition will just be a very short snippet of the really vast experience they have. But they're free to talk about whatever they would like, kind of reflecting on the fact that most of our participants today are graduate students or just looking to get into this field. So after that, my hope is that we have 20 to 25 minutes for an open question and answer. And as I mentioned before, if you've got questions throughout, and I think Adriana, one of our CID event planning members, posted this in the chat, please do ask your questions as we go along, and we will try to come back to those in the question and answer period. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Really great to see everybody today. Thanks so much for joining us. So we'll start with Ania Chaluda, who's the Associate Director for Research and Evaluation at FHI 360. Then we'll go to Margaret Wawira, who's the Acting Chief Executive Officer for the Regional Education Learning Initiative, Africa. Then I'll go to Oliver Neuschmidt, who's the lead of the capacity building team at the IEA. Then we'll hear from Saamira Halabi, who's a senior education specialist at the World Bank. Then we'll go to Leela Ram, who's an education specialist at USAID. And we'll finish it up with Sarah Beardmore, who's a senior partnership specialist at the Global Partnership for Education, or GPE. So once again, thanks so much for everybody for joining us today. Really exciting to hear our bits of wisdom from our panelists. So we're going to hand it over to Ania. And 7 minutes or so, Ania, and then we'll move over to Margaret. So I'm going to mute myself and invite you to get us started, Ania. So feel free to take us away.
Thank you, Will. Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you all virtually. My name is Ania Chaluda, and I'm an Associate Director at the Research and Evaluation Department at FHI 360, which is a nonprofit human development organization. My department, Research and Evaluation, is situated within our G3E business unit, with G3 standing for Education, Employment, and Engagement. In my role, I oversee a team of M&E specialists who directly support programs implemented by FHI 360 across the world in 3 key technical areas: education, but also civil society and economic empowerment. In addition to helping my team provide support to projects, I also have my own portfolio. My largest project at the moment focuses on implementation research conducted on nurturing care and playful parenting programs in 4 countries: Serbia, Zambia, Bhutan, and Rwanda. This is one of the most interesting research projects that I have worked on because it's very comprehensive. In each country, we are conducting in-depth interviews with key stakeholders, focus group discussions with community members, observations of how service providers supported by those programs are delivering services. We also conduct a survey of service providers to assess their knowledge. And also, in addition to that, we conduct a large-scale data collection to measure outcomes in terms of parenting practices and child outcomes. So it's quite comprehensive, but it has been super interesting to see how much you can learn when you follow implementation so closely. A little bit about my path here. I moved to the US from Poland almost 20 years ago. And at the time, I knew I wanted to do three things: work in education, work internationally, and work with data. I found a project that I thought was the perfect fit for me, that gave me an opportunity to work on analyzing education data, looking at trends, and developing education projections. My project was funded by USAID and was housed within Academy for Educational Development. As I was working at AED and I was learning about all the great work that my colleagues were doing on the ground, I decided that I wanted to be closer to implementation. I wanted to learn about what these projects are doing and how they're doing it. I wanted to know what we are learning from how we are implementing these projects. And I was particularly interested in impact evaluations and their potential in sort of uncovering what works in international development. So I felt that M&E, monitoring and evaluation, is a great fit for me. There are a few things that I wanted to highlight in terms of what I see as important aspects of my job. If you are interested in M&E of international development projects. First, as I'm sure you know, localization is a very important theme in this work. What that means that there is no design of M&E systems without inputs from the people who will be most affected by those projects and whose lives we are hoping to improve. So in my job, I work very closely with male specialists on the ground who really are those who know the context best and know well whether a certain M&E approach will work for their projects or not, and how we can adapt it to make it fit a given context better. And we can go even deeper and in the design of M&E systems, consult communities where our programming or our research is implemented. This is particularly important in the development of M&E tools, instruments, all of which should be always carefully piloted before they are used as part of M&E systems. Second, I also wanted to emphasize that a successful M&E system, to me, is one that generates learnings for adaptive management and also contributes to building evidence base on what works in international development. I'm sure that many of you have heard about USAID Collaborating Learning and Adapting Framework, CLA, which drives a lot of our efforts on integrating learning into MEL systems. We often use formative research to generate insights about programming. I have mentioned that I was particularly interested in impact evaluations at some point in the beginning of my career, and I still very much value impact evaluations, but I also have a lot of appreciation now for how difficult sometimes it might be to integrate impact evaluation design into a given project. So a lot of what I do in my job is figuring out what will generate most rigorous evidence in particular circumstances and selling that vision to key stakeholders who can be project staff or funders. So for each project, we develop learning agendas and make sure to use rigorous quantitative and qualitative methodologies. Then we also find ways to disseminate the findings both internally and externally. Finally, I wanted to say a little bit about the skills and knowledge that I think are needed if you're interested in doing M&E in international development. And for that, I'm going to break down what we do on a daily basis when we support programs. In the beginning of a program, we help with the design of a log frame and theory of change and the development of indicators. So being comfortable facilitating these discussions is important. Once a project is running, we do a lot of tool and instrument development. So knowing how to develop a questionnaire that minimizes potential bias is also an important skill. As much as possible, we try to use tools that have been already validated in similar contexts. So knowledge about what's out there in terms of evidence around measurement tools, assessment methodologies, and so on. That's very helpful. Once we have the instruments developed, then it's time for data collection. And a lot of what I do really comes down to research management, helping to oversee data collection processes to ensure that they produce higher quality data. Once we have that data, either coming from our regular monitoring or large data collection activities, then our role is also to communicate insights from that data either internally with the technical team or externally to the broader international development audience to make sure that the findings are understood and can be utilized to make international development programming more effective. And while I don't usually run statistical analysis and data for my evaluations, because we have analysts on the team who can do that, I need to have background in research methods to understand the results and be able to communicate them to others. And just to mention at the end is one of the things that I love about my job is also that it constantly changes. Programs that I support change, people I work with change, countries change, and I can honestly say that I learn something new from every project that I support, and I try to carry on those learnings from one project to the next. So that's all I have for today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at the end. Thank you.
Perfect. It's a great way to get us started. Really appreciate it. I think for those that are looking at jobs in the field, you'll see monitoring and evaluation a lot. And I think this is a great way to get a sense of what that might actually look like as kind of a day-to-day effort. What are the skills you need to work in an area like that? So thanks so much for getting us started. So as we move along, again, please do ask any questions you have to the chat, and we'll try to get to those. But I'm going to now invite Margaret Wawira to join us and share her stories and insights. So Margaret, take it away.
Thank you so much, Will. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. It's such an honor to be part of this panel today to share my insights based on my experience as an education development expert. So, as you heard, my name is Margaret Wawira. I come from Kenya, which is a country in the African continent. And I think I'm going to share my insights in form of a story because unlike many people who have a background in education, my background was completely different. And how I found myself in education was very interesting. So I was born in a rural community in a small village in central Kenya. Born to a family of 3 girls. I'm the middle child. Growing up, I was a very inquisitive child. I joined school quite early, actually, and my learning journey has been very instrumental, to the work that I do today. So initially, as a young girl, coming from a family of very independent and strong women, I always had an interest in women empowerment. When I was in campus, I even started an association. Some of you may know them as clubs, called Kadada, which stands, it's Swahili for Wake Up Lady. And I was, running this association to empower young ladies, my fellow, students at the campus level. So when I graduated, so my education background is in international relations, both undergraduate and master's level. At the undergraduate level, as I mentioned, my passion was women empowerment. So my focus was on gender studies. But at the master's level, I centered around human rights, which again, I think has been very instrumental to the work that I do as well. So regarding my career journey, I have worked in different sectors. My first job after graduation was actually in marketing, which is very interesting. But I worked there for a while. Then I moved to a community-based organization where we were empowering, women groups that were creating impact through self-initiated programs, empowering them to be able to scale up those initiatives. And I moved there to take an internship at a regional human rights organization. And at this organization, I also worked on different things, but it's where I will discover my career niche, as I call it. So I worked on children's rights, but I think I'm too compassionate and my heart is too soft for some of the things that we were dealing with. So I said, there are people who are more, who can create better impact here, without having mental problems and mental breakdowns because of what we're dealing with. I worked on girls' rights, issues of FGM, child marriage, but again, that was tough. But then the organization where I was working, the human rights organization, they wanted to establish a program on education. And I remember I volunteered to be part of the team that was establishing that program. So for me, it started from having to learn the education landscape, but I think it was like a light bulb moment for me because on a very personal level, I relate with how access to quality education empowers marginalized children and provides them with an opportunity at a better future. So, and for many children within our context where we work, education is actually the only opportunity they have to lift themselves out of poverty and get a better future. So, I've worked in the education sector for slightly over 9 years now, and I've worked mostly with marginalized communities in my experience. So right now, I'm at a network. So I've done a lot of program implementation. So working with communities, approaching education as a human right, where we were working to empower communities to understand, their rights as rights holders and how they can demand for that right, from the government, which has an obligation to provide this right. So working with communities, working with children as well. I always take advantage of every opportunity I have when I meet with children just to encourage them to pursue education, with a lot of fierceness because it won't fail them in the future. So right now, my position is, so I'm working at the Regional Education Learning Initiative Africa. We call it RELI Africa, which is a peer learning and policy influencing network of about 70 civil society organizations in the East African region. So here we work to transform organizations into high-functioning vehicles of change. So my experience with implementation is very useful to what I do now because it includes empowering, these organizations to be more impactful in what they do, to be able to scale up some of the innovations that they're implementing. And interesting fact, all our members are working with children we call farthest behind. So these are children who've been really marginalized when it comes to accessing quality education. We're in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. The landscape is somehow similar. The challenges, very, very common and also very similar when it comes to, inclusion and all that. And collaboratively, I think we are so strong as a policy influencing network because even when we approach governments as a collective, when we speak in one voice, they are more likely to listen, and they do listen. So there are two key things I think I would like to share, with the team here about what, there are actually three that I've learned in my career journey. I think as an educationist, passion, compassion, and empathy. And I'm sure you believe in the intrinsic value of education. So it's not just a job because, what I was saying about many children, this is their greatest hope actually. So there is that passion of going above and beyond. And it's tied to the purpose of what we do and why we do what we do, and how impactful the little that you do, is for the children that, look up to us across the globe. Then the second thing is, a different perspective. And I think that's what we need, especially for most of you who are coming out of school. A lot of research has been done. Many meetings have been held to discuss the learning crisis in Africa and around the globe. We understand some of these problems. We know to some extent what needs to be done, and a lot has been done. But we still see the same issues decades and decades after. So those different perspectives on what we can do differently to be able to impact children, especially with those programs targeting children directly and then trying to change the education systems is really important. And the third thing is collaboration. So my work is mostly just around collaboration. I bring people together, I coordinate people to work collaboratively. And so changing education systems, especially speaking from my context, is no one man's job. You can dare, sometimes you look at the impact you're creating and it's barely a drop in the ocean, but that drop in the ocean is also very important. And you need different people at different levels, different, sectors to work together to be able to create long-lasting change. I think I'd like to end with this famous quote from Nelson Mandela that I live by and that I really like to reference. He said education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And as educationists, education is when children get an education, that is something that empowers them. And in itself, it's an indispensable way of realizing other rights as well. So it's a very noble career. And the passion, again, just emphasizing the passion and just linking to how important it is for many children across the globe. Thank you, Will, and I'm looking forward to interacting more. Over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Margaret. I think really finding something that you care about and are passionate about is part of the thing some students are continuing to try to figure out, like, where do I really fit in this? Where do I care? Where's my passion? And I think you really do a good job illustrating that. So, Oliver, it's going to be over to you now. So,
yes, thank you, Will. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Oliver Neuschmidt, and I'm currently the team lead of IEA's capacity building team. Maybe a few words about the organization I'm working in. IEA means International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, and it is a non-profit international scientific association of national research organizations. The objective of the IEA is to better understand education and in consequence help their members then to develop evidence-based policies to improve education. IEA does this by conducting large-scale comparative studies in education. Most of them are curriculum-based assessments in primary and secondary education. So maybe some of you have already heard about TIMSS or PEARLS. So TIMSS is a mathematics and science study, PEARLS a reading study. So even if you don't know the name IEA, those studies are sometimes more known in the world, as up to 60, 70 countries are participating in those. In later stages, also directing other studies, for example, OECD TALIS, or including analysis and research activities, were added to the portfolios. While the Secretariat is in Amsterdam, most people are here in Hamburg, where I work. We have here at the moment more than 170 employees from over 30 nationalities. So that also for me makes the work interesting, because working language is English, and you have a lot of different cultures here. My position here for the last 15 years was that of a unit head or department head or co-unit head in different constellations over the 15 years. And I was responsible here for the international data processing or later international studies unit. So all what had to do with international assessments here at the IIA. So main tasks in consequence were to oversee the increasing number of international studies we had here at the IEA. And as you can see also from the name change, and also if I tell you that when I started, we had about 10 employees in that area. It was 2007 when I became unit head, and now 45, that also the job focus changed quite a lot during that period, from a more content related one to a managerial one. I always try to balance both sides a little bit, because I always found the content side very important for me to focus. And I had a lot of different projects in the meanwhile in low and middle income countries. So it started first in Latin America, where I worked on childhood indicators, doing some advisory work here in the Middle East, and later in Haiti, where I'm still working in, and where I got a lot of in touch with the needs for support from countries in those regions to collect reliable data in order really to use that data later on to create evidence-based policymaking. I liked that area very much, was fascinated from this, and also wanted to more to transfer my knowledge and the experience of the organizations also to these partners in the countries, partner organizations such as ministries and universities and other organizations. And therefore, a couple of years ago, we founded basically a dedicated teams of experts from different areas of the IEA here, our capacity building team, which specially focused on these kind of special projects. So not so much on standardized cycles of assessment like the TIMSS and PEARLS or ICCS, but rather focusing on lower and middle income countries' needs, either to help them with courses and other kinds of capacity building, training seminars, and so on, exchange programs, also to develop their own national assessment system, or help them to participate in international assessments. And we also had some special projects which fall through the cracks in IEA. So for example, last year, we tried to link, or we did successfully basically link regional assessments. There are a couple of them in the sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and the Latin American countries. We linked them to the international TIMSS and PEARLS scales. This was a strategy for measuring the Sustainable Development Goals. So more and more work came in this area. The project were financed usually by banks like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Banks, or other donor organizations like the Gates Foundation. I must admit that over time, I noticed that if in doubt, I would put my focus rather on the content side. And I was, as I said, more enthusiastic about helping and transferring knowledge than doing the managerial part of a growing international department, which I have now more than 45 people. So I decided in autumn last year to step down from that responsibility and just fully focus on the capacity building area. So that is why I stepped down. So that was also an interesting step for me, because also hierarchically it is a step down, but I must admit I fully relieved that I have now the possibility to concentrate on the capacity building side, to intensify collaborations with other regional assessments, organizations, and so on, and not be too much divided on tasks that cannot be fulfilled by one position. Will asked me also quickly to talk a little bit about the career path of planning, and that is maybe a little bit different than for many of you, or at least as you envision your own, because I came completely by coincidence to the education area. And also that I work now for close to 25 years in one of the same organization probably is not that typical anymore, I assume. I started originally studied biology on diploma, but the situation in that field was and probably still is difficult. You only could do project work and there was no sustainable position. So I had a further education as a network specialist and developer, which brought me a first job, but which I didn't like too much in the software development area. And then suddenly I was approached by a friend of mine who worked here in the accounting department. And she told me, hey, Oliver, don't you want to work for IA? It's just 3 minutes away and we do here some interesting projects. It had really no clue. So I came from a completely different area, but it was interesting. I applied, and at that time, of course, we were not so specialized. I got a chance and I basically started from the beginning with the project of TIMS at that time. I became project manager and then later on, as I said, a unit head. So what I learned from this basically for myself is in a way, and maybe that may also help some of you, that is not necessarily to have all those skills necessary at the beginning, which you think you need to have for a certain position, at least here. Of course, organizations become more specialized, and if you want to be programmer, it doesn't make sense to start without programming skills. But also when I employed people here, it was always more important to have certain soft skills, certain openness to opportunities, for example, some flexibility and adjust to changing situation, timelines, and so on. And of course, an interest in really learning and learning new things. Lifelong learning, I would say, is a very important skill you would need. And if you want to work in an area like I do, then of course the international intercultural communication competences are in a way needed. And depending from what you do exactly, of course, certain technical and statistical foundations are necessarily, I would say. Okay, I'm at the end of my part, I think. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Oliver. Really appreciate it. I'm sure over your time at the IEA, that's a massive change from 10 to over 100 people working in Hamburg now, and just so many changes in ILSAs overall. It's been quite interesting. So thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, welcome, Saamira. I'm going to hand it over to you. It's good to see you. It's been quite some time.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you to the participants for joining, and it's great to hear from my fellow panelists. I have to say, I agree with so much already that has been said. Ania said that there was never a dull day, there was so much change in the job, which kept it interesting, and I can very much relate to that in my role as a senior education specialist at the World Bank. And Margaret talked about, the idea of education being a social elevator, being one of the, still remains one of the most powerful tools for social mobility. And I really support that. And I feel the same way about, what I do in my job. And Oliver just mentioned something that I thought was really important, which is the need to be flexible and to have a range of skills, which again, those are all things that I was going to say, but they've been said already. So I'll move on to sort of my little presentation. So my name is Saamira Halabi. I go by Sam. I'm a senior education specialist at the World Bank, where I've been here for about 10 years. I'm currently in what we call the Global Engagement and Knowledge Unit, which is sort of the hub unit that does a lot of the global public goods and partner coordination, and we manage cross-cutting initiatives. Prior to my joining this unit, about 2 years ago, I was in what we call operations, which is more focused on working directly with countries on lending projects and analytical work. So I had been a specialist working on the Middle East and North Africa with a lot of experience on a range of countries, including Jordan, Djibouti, Tunisia, Morocco, some fragile countries like Yemen and Afghanistan. And then my first year here, I worked on Senegal and Nigeria. So overall, it's been a really great 10 years of exposure and learning. So how did I get here? I was actually Will's colleague. I think I was a few years ahead of Will in our PhD program at Penn State, where we were both studying education theory and policy. We shared an advisor, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but we were in the same research group for a couple of years. And I did my research looking at TIMSS data, actually using the TIMSS, I think it was 2007 at the time. It's been a while, but that was the most current data, looking at the difference inequalities in school resources across schools, types of schools in the Middle East and North Africa. And while I was a graduate student at Penn State, I was the managing editor for the Comparative Education Review. So that gave me a lot of good insight into, research and what flies and what doesn't make it through the gates for publication. And then prior to my PhD program at Penn State, I was a master's student at Vanderbilt University. And I came to Vanderbilt on a Fulbright scholarship from my home country, Lebanon. And it was at Vanderbilt really that I met some of you might be familiar with Steve Heinemann, who is one of the, I think, most prolific researchers and writers on education development in our field. And so I was very fortunate to have him be my mentor and really open a lot of doors for me and make a lot of connections that helped me overall in my career. So that's a little bit of my background. So I think maybe I'll talk now about, some of the skills that I think are important for the participants here to think about. So if you're in a PhD program, I mean, the most important skill you're building is research skills, and that's great. That's going to come in very handy. For my job, that is important, but that's not my priority. That's not my main, our main currency here. In addition to having a good, solid research background, it's also really important to be able to communicate about about research or about what the evidence shows. I think that is something that as researchers we might struggle with or we don't pay enough attention to. So how do I talk about this to different audiences, including policymakers, government officials, people who might not have a background in education, right? How do I make this salient and relevant? So I think communicating about what you're doing, about your research is really important, not just to the education community, because we speak the same language a lot of the times, but really making it more salient. A lot of what we do is also advocacy. So, the Minister of Finance, who you have to convince to allocate more budget to education, needs to really understand why, and having that ability to communicate, I think, is really, really crucial. At least in my role in my field at the World Bank, it might be different, obviously, in different organizations and in different settings. The other skill that I think helped me is something that Oliver referred to, which is just flexibility and being open to a range of different experiences. So while I was in grad school, I also did a lot of project management. So I took on different project management roles, which were important. Teamwork. So being able to work as part of a team is really, again, the World Bank is a big bureaucracy, and it's not, you really can't get anything done without involving a lot of other people across the institution. And being able to lead that way, so being able to integrate different skills and abilities I think that is, something that helped me. It's not easy. I'm still learning, but that's something that I would encourage you to start to think about how you can do this. And being able to write. I mean, we all I know are at a pretty high level of writing, being in graduate programs, but being able to write for different audiences, it goes back to my point on communication. I think being able to write in short but effective and informative formats that are not just publications for a research journal, which frankly our policymakers do not read. So we have to find more creative and more effective ways to get the messages across. Something we've been working on at the World Bank very intensively is on the learning crisis and learning poverty, and how do we address that? And that's required really a lot of digging deep and talking about really what's happening in the classroom at a very granular level. And that's been a challenge because, a lot of the times we focus on more of the macro level issues, at least from where we sit. But really, the learning crisis is happening in the classrooms. And that's where we're trying to shift the conversation to really focus on what is the teacher doing? Do the students have textbooks? Are they aligned with the science of reading? Is the country or the teacher assessing the students to find out where they are? There's a lot of these cross-cutting issues that are important for all of us in the field to master, even if it might not be our specific niche area of research or focus. But what we're finding is that there hasn't been enough attention paid to what's happening in the classroom. And so that would be my other sort of advice to the group here, which is, if you're at the beginning stages of your research, or if you're at the beginning of your career in this area, making the linkage between the policy level issues that are happening at the center and how it's impacting what happens, in a rural school. I think that's kind of the link that we need to strengthen as the community. I think one of the challenges for me was moving from a PhD program into this space is, the lack, well, as a researcher or as a PhD student, at least in our experience, I think Will and I, we had a lot of autonomy, we had a lot of independence, really. And it didn't feel, our relationship with our superior, our advisor wasn't hierarchical in the same way that it is in a sort of corporate organization or in a bureaucracy. So one of the adjustments that I had to learn to make is that, I have a manager, I have a boss, and that boss really will direct my work. It's not, I can't pursue an interesting idea necessarily, right? Because it's something that I think will be fun to do. Or so you have to, making that shift from academia to a more organized sort of bureaucracy was a challenge for me in the beginning. I think I'm doing okay now. I think I've overcome that, but it was a learning experience. Just another piece of advice I think that is helpful is to, I'm sure people have heard this before, but connect and network, and try to make your interests and your research known to others in the community. And really, I mean, I never really liked the word networking, or the idea that we have to sort of have these transactional types of connections, but really your connections in the space will be helpful for you. And so try to nurture those, and they will, connect you to other opportunities or other people who might help you in your research or in your career. So yeah, that remains an important part of your career. Who you know and how well you can communicate your interests and your skills. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam. Please do continue to ask questions in the chat. Sam, it's good to see you. I remember my first year in PhD, Sam was on our team. She was brilliant. She was also quite intimidating for me in my first year as a PhD. I was a brilliant student, so it's good to see you again after some time. All right, Leela.
Yes, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Leela Ram from Pakistan. Happy to be with you today. And many thanks to the Moray House for inviting me for this panel. And also thanks to all of you. Whenever I see students, I find more meaning to my work and I learn more. So thank you again. I will briefly reflect upon my professional journey to share some relevant experiences. I hope you will find them helpful for your career. As a development professional, I have managed several programs to improve basic education through policy reforms, community engagement, teacher training, and private sector engagement all over Pakistan. Over the years, I have worked with an NGO, UN organization, and a bilateral mission. These three organizations are Teachers Resource Center, TRC, UNICEF, and the USAID. Currently, I'm at USAID and have been working there since 2014 as project management specialist for education. Before joining the development sector, I also worked as a high school teacher for a year, and those classroom level experience are always helpful for me. Let me explain the local context of my professional work. So here are three highlights. When I say I work to promote basic education, I mean school education, including early childhood education, primary education, and secondary education. Second, development sector's efforts for basic education in Pakistan predominantly focus on public sector education because marginalized communities cannot afford private schools. Third, Pakistan's education scenario for development sectors is very complex. More than 20 million school-age children are out of school, which is 40% of the school-age population. Those who are enrolled in public schools, they face challenge of getting quality education. COVID-19 and recent floods have further decreased their chances of being educated. So this is the context where my professional work is focused. My key responsibility include to design, manage, and monitor education projects. These projects are implemented by different implementing partners, including the host government, international and local NGOs, universities, and private sector organizations, depending on the nature of the project. My other duties include coordination, grant management, proposal evaluation, data management, and report writing. Now let's move to my personal learning, potentially be relevant to your career. I would highlight 6 points with this hope that you may find helpful. Number 1, everyone is unique and has a different kind of a career plans and expectations from jobs. One size doesn't fit for all. Having said this, my general advice would be, in the beginning of your career, it's good to work in different thematic areas instead of being choosy. After some times, you may find that what is the best area where you can further build your expertise. During this process, you may have surprising results, probably different from your initial thinking. So the bottom line is say yes to diverse experiences. If possible, please don't restrict yourself within your favorite domain. Number 2, there are some common attributes required for all jobs, whether you are working with an NGO or an international donor agency. Together with interpersonal skills, adaptability, openness, respect for diversity, and drive for results are key to survive and thrive in professional life. Think how you can further strengthen these attributes if needed. Number 3, tracking emerging trends in the current era is very important. Education sector is heavily affected by climate change, disasters, and conflicts around the globe. These emerging trends are also impacting to the skill set and technical knowledge required for new jobs in the sector. If you plan to contribute to this field, please be aware, prepared, and flexible to respond to new professional needs. Number 4, in the beginning of your career, you may think that the technical knowledge of some thematic area is the most important thing. But later you may realize that the technical knowledge without certain abilities, such as team management, coordination, and flexibility, may not produce the required result for you. Please think about these abilities while you think about your career move. Number 5, if I recall my student life discourses at the University of Sydney while I was doing Masters in Education, I tend to ask you one question. Do you really believe that academic experts, policymakers, and practitioners live at different planets? If your answer is yes, don't worry about it. But the most important thing is we should not keep such barriers in our mind. If we go with openness in the development sector and don't wear the glasses of preconceived lenses, we would be surprised to know that all these stakeholders are closely linked and have a good appetite to connect the dots. And you can also be a good connector to bridge the gap between them if required. So approaching employers with constructive and looking forward approach always help. Last point, 6, as an education person, you should be aware of the importance of hidden curricula. This is very important for working in the education sector. Generally, hidden curriculum refer to the unwritten, unofficial, and unplanned values perspectives that students learn in the schools. We as a development professional need to be aware of social fabric and values to run impactful projects in a particular context. Development employers value a lot such insights and knowledge. This will be helpful for you in the sector. So before I end, I would request you, please don't lose the sight of a specific context and a big picture while you are preparing for a particular job or you work somewhere. And of course, tolerance for ambiguity is always a strength, and being responsive to new learning is highly valuable. I will end here. Thanks for your passion and happy to receive questions. Over.
Excellent. Thanks, Leela. I hope everybody else is also taking notes on all the different skills and suggestions everybody has shared. I think there's some really gold there. So I want to invite our final person up. So Sarah, it is now your turn to wrap us up today. So thank you so much for joining and welcome.
Great. Thanks, Will, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here. I don't actually often get to reflect on my career, so it's been an interesting kind of assignment, actually. But I suppose I'll just start by introducing myself. Sarah Beardmore. I work at the Global Partnership for Education. It's a partnership and a fund, and we support education development in the world's sort of low and lower middle income countries. It is I think a fairly new organization in the sense that it was born as a trust fund 20 years ago, but only really starting in about 2010, 2011 when I joined was it really constituted as an independent organization with a big fund, and so in some ways I feel like I got in on the ground floor of a startup organization, and I've had many roles there over the years. But my current position as a senior partnership specialist is within the partnerships team and looking really to how we can leverage all of the assets, expertise, and contributions of the different partners that GPE has towards our mission of a quality education for every child. Really concretely, what that means is I manage partnerships with technical assistance organizations, really supporting the design of initiatives to help countries address various policy challenges. This is sort of a new area of GPE's work, and so in some ways it's kind of like the design, test, and scale kind of process is what I really manage at GPE. I also, I think, have a role that's not just looking at technical assistance as you know, facilitating partners with expertise to work with ministries, but actually situating that within the wider kind of strategic work of GPE. So, for example, right now, one of the key areas that I'm leading on is GPE's work on climate change, and particularly looking at how to support more climate smart education systems. And that has involved commissioning research to understand the key entry points for system reform around climate resilience and climate action. And then designing a partnership to help ministries actually integrate climate resilience strategies into their education sector policies and plans, including data, cross-sectoral coordination, pedagogy. And that technical assistance involved developing partnerships with Save the Children and UNESCO to work with ministries. But on the heels of that is a kind of wider strategic question around how GPE should be moving into a more proactive role in looking at the impacts of climate change on the sector, and kind of leveraging our role as a fund, as a voice in the sector, as a key sort of normative voice for what good practice might look like in the sector, helping to mobilize, co-financing from different climate funds. So as a partnership specialist in the center of all of that, there's the kind of instrumental work of GPE based on the different kind of tools that GPE has. But then there is the world of education development, which requires like really looking for strategic opportunities to advance GPE's voice in the field, to try to find new opportunities to bring in additional financing for education. And so there is a kind of an opportunistic and strategic role to this as well. I didn't really plan to end up at GPE. In fact, the last place I thought I would ever end up is actually in international development. My background, I've had a career, let's say, for about 20 years. And I really started with studies. I did a bachelor's at McGill University in sociology. I was really interested in social change, in nation states, in democracy. And I then followed that up with a degree in political sociology from the London School of Economics. And a lot of my work was actually on human rights, on understanding the kind of politics of resistance and social movements. Was heavily involved in a lot of the World Social Forum organizing, got into student activism, working on economic justice issues. And so really a lot of my focus was on looking at power asymmetries and trying to understand where there might be room for social movements to really create openings in terms of democracy and human rights. So for me, international development was a kind of post-colonial structure that I was really, really hesitant to get involved in. But that all kind of changed when I got involved in education, because I realized that actually the most radical change that we can achieve in terms of changing hearts and minds and changing the trajectory of society is really starting with education. And so from that point of view, I joined an advocacy organization called Results, started managing the Education for All campaign that was helping to mobilize political support and financing for education around the world. And so, I really took this sort of background in student activism and became a kind of supporter of activists myself through these advocacy organizations and coalitions that I was a part of. Some of that involved watchdog research on World Bank financing, looking at IMF policies and their role in constraining national education budgets, and really trying to understand where there were levers for change at a kind of national scale in terms of education. And I think as part of that, I ended up being asked to join GPE really on just a temporary secondment to help them think through how they were going to mobilize financing from donor governments to help make this tiny trust fund in the bank, a global fund for education. So I started in 2011 just on a temporary assignment there. My NGO lent me to GPE. And I helped to engage with civil society partners, try to look at what an advocacy campaign might be around education financing. And and then ultimately was brought on full-time and offered a position to basically support GPE's regular replenishments. So all of that to say, I think the lesson learned is that we don't always end up where we're meant to be. We don't always know where we're meant to be. And that, I think, in some ways, I started looking at sociology because my brain already thought that way. That was already how I kind of examined the world. I studied things that I had no idea what the career was going to be. I mean, political sociology doesn't necessarily lead to, a particular position in the world. So it was really from that kind of critical thinking lens that I just followed what felt right to me with the way that I think. And then as opportunities came up, really just used my judgment about do I think I have some skills and gifts to bring this particular mission? And, is it aligned with my ultimate motivation, which is really around social change? And by using that barometer, that was where the yes or no in me came up about whether to apply for particular positions or to try to seek out work in different areas. Ultimately, I think the thing that really was the kind of highlight of the last sort of 10 years at GPE, and I think which in some ways has sort of helped me understand better where I thrive, was the opportunity for GPE to set up a fund to actually finance civil society transparency and accountability in education. And I had come into GPE really as this NGO outsider that was brought into this, sort of quasi World Bank institution to try to change it from the inside. And so when our board was open to setting up a kind of permanent grant fund for civil society, I, stuck my hand up and was really excited to be able to work on designing that. I'm talking to folks from foundations and other funders around how you do really progressive funding for civil society. And in some ways, that ended up helping me really situate myself as more of a design type of person. So I now am in charge of designing these types of partnerships to do new things, to help GPE think through how to step into new spaces. And it helps to kind of have that kind of creativity and the ability to sort of continually be pushing the bounds of what GPE is possible. I think a couple of things just to finish on in terms of advice. One thing that I learned, the hard way and now and sort of in a seasoned way is really don't hesitate to ask your supervisors to work on the things that you want to work on. I think there were times when I was shy and there was really exciting work and I didn't sort of indicate my interest, and that work has evolved and done really exciting things. And I thought, oh, if only I had sort of been more proactive in saying, hey, I really want to be a part of that. So don't hesitate. And, the worst that can happen is your supervisor will say, sorry, but you're too busy with other things. But that will help you to shape the path that you take and end up building your knowledge in areas that you're passionate about, because ultimately that's what you're going to take with you. Long after you've left that organization or you've moved into a different role, that experience that you've been able to kind of proactively seize is what will shape your profile. So, and what you'll bring with you. I think also, get out in the field as much as possible. I hate the term the field, but I think that already we are among the most privileged in the world by having an advanced degree. And I think just remembering that makes you privileged and you have a responsibility. And in international education, make sure that you're grounding everything that you do and say in, the lives of ordinary people who ultimately we are working on behalf of and in service to. And that's really who we should be taking the lead from. So I think just to never forget that, because it's very easy in the rarefied air of the World Bank spring meetings or the G7 kind of political sphere to forget that actually that is a responsibility we need to take with us into whatever role we're privileged enough to get. Let me stop there because I want to make sure there's enough time for discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I am going to stop sharing my slides for a second and invite others to feel free to post questions. We're getting a few in. I'm sure we'll get some more coming up. So as people are adding questions, I wanted to kick off a little bit. And I think this is, I think Margaret, Oliver, and Sarah, all of you talked about education wasn't your first kind of career or first interest. Wondering, for those individuals that are joining us that are trying to get into education and development that might have started somewhere else, any additional advice you can give them on moving into a different area, whether it's, focusing on different transferable skills? Do they need to go back and get a different degree? What advice would you give them on somebody who, maybe has a different educational background that is now trying to get into this work? So I don't know who wants to jump in there, but I know we've got multiple people that have spoke to that. So Oliver, why don't you get us started?
Good, yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned at the end of my short presentation, I think that mainly that in many areas, those soft skills are counting a lot, and that it's not so much different whether it's in biology or in education or somewhere else. Of course, it's not sufficient just to have soft skills, that's for sure. But for example, for me, I had to do also in biology with data sets, for example, and research and publications and something like this. So even part of the technical elements or structures were the same. I even was visiting research conferences, but then not for education, but rather for soil science or something like this. So I would say that a lot of those skills can be transferred. Also, especially all those technical computational skills, mathematics or statistics or so on, you would need in many areas. So for me, this could be transferred very well. I must admit, though, that when I did that transfer, that IA just had really a handful of people, and everyone did basically everything. So I wanted to say they were really looking more for people versatile, going into different areas, learning a lot. And now, of course, we have different departments. And if you want to apply for let's say for my area, for example, yes, I would look for sure for people who already worked and have some experience in that area. For myself, I want to add quickly, and I didn't mention this maybe before, I was thinking similar things also along the way. Wouldn't it be not necessary at a certain moment to have a certain degree in that area or to come into this? Because I came into this area just by data processing. So that's also why I can easily say I transfer here something, whether it is biology or data processing. But at a certain moment, this was, of course, not sufficient and not really making me happy, I would say, as I wanted to really help countries and organizations. So I need to understand the whole set. What is an assessment? How is it working? How is the impact? How do you analyze the data? What do you do with all that? And so I decided at a certain moment to do my PhD later on. So it was in 2014 when I did it next to work. But I must also admit that it was a little bit more challenging than I expected, especially next to work. So it took me some 5 relatively heavy years, and I had thought it would be easier as I have so much knowledge and experience already. But to get through all these theoretical foundations, that was more the challenge, not running the analysis, writing up the stuff, but it was really getting the background, the literature, research, and so on. That took very long. But I found it important really now to be also into that area and have a degree, not as a degree as such, but having the knowledge what is done here. So because that is, of course, a little bit missing if you come from a completely different area. So what I only could advise, not necessarily to do a PhD. I wouldn't have done it if you would ask me now afterwards, but at least to get a little bit more acquainted with the backgrounds, so with the topic basically at hand, so with the theory behind it. So.
Excellent, thanks. Margaret or Sarah, either of you want to add to that?
Happy to. I think I agree with what has been said. I think most of these technical skills are transferable. It's very easy, to fit in within the education sector. But maybe what I would recommend for me, I found a coach, someone who I could learn from, someone who understood education, especially in my context. He was a professor actually, so he understood that background, because it's very important to understand how the system works, some of those theories, so that you're able to contribute meaningfully to the sector. Then I'm actually considering, I feel like there's still a gap for me, at least. So I'm still considering going back to school and just delving deeper into understand the history of education and how it has changed over the years, so that I can be, more impactful in the work that I do. So just adding those two things, a coach may be helpful, someone in education. And if you're thinking about changing, it means you have an interest, at least, in making a change in the education sector. So a coach will be a good idea, and maybe even those short courses. I think I've taken a few on just education, and education is a right will be useful.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to jump to Leon's question. It was one of the first questions we had. So, and Leon talks about marginalized communities in America, in my experience, primarily focus on Black and Brown communities, access to and funding for equitable programming in low-income schools and communities is the primary work focus. But understanding poverty is global, but the Black experience tends to be specific to America. So how can we translate this experience to a global workspace? I know we've got multiple people working in the States that are probably quite familiar with hearing about the Black experience in the States. So Ania, I was wondering, since FHI 360 is located, can you speak to this question at all about how do we translate kind of the Black experience as it's known for marginalized communities in the States to this global workspace?
Sure. I mean, I can say that definitely we think about, as I mentioned, localization and DEI principles a lot in our work now. And part of that is to identify for each and every project who those marginalized communities specifically are and how they're going to be affected by what we do. So one of the things we do when we come in to do a new project is we do what is called a GESI analysis, gender equity and social inclusion analysis. So that is that usually involves a desk review of sort of contextual documents that we can find on each country, and specifically in the area that we will be working in, and also interviews with the stakeholders, with the government, with communities where we will be working in. And based on what we find, and hopefully we find who those marginalized communities in a given context are, we come up with some sort of an action plan for how to make sure that we do no harm as we're implementing the project, and we do not sort of make their situation of the marginalized communities even worse, and make sure that they are included. So that's kind of like how we think about it in our work, to just always have that open mind about what are potential consequences of our project for maybe some people we are not like directly or immediately thinking about as most affected, but turns out once we learn about the context, those people are can be potentially affected by what we do. So we just want to have a plan for how to address it in our implementation.
Perfect. Thanks, Ania. So I'm going to open this one up to anybody on the panel that wants it, but thinking about, everybody here has talked about the importance of connection, collaborating, networking. For those that are maybe just at the beginning of their journey and trying to figure out how do we make these connections. I know both Oliver and Sam were talking about either having a friend or having a faculty member. It was really key as that kind of gatekeeper for them to get into it. But if you just don't necessarily have that person, how do you network? What's the advice on networking to make these connections in the field? Anybody want to jump in? So Sam, you just popped up. Why don't you get us
Yeah,
started?
I think, conferences are a good meeting place for a lot of people in our field. Asking questions, like genuine questions. I've had people reach out to me who I don't know, who I don't have connections to, but they were able to get my attention by making it very clear to me how they could help me. Right. So a generic, I'm interested in this field email is, I think, less likely to get a response than I saw this project that was just approved. This is how I can, contribute because I have XYZ skills. Do you have time to talk? Right. So there's a subtle but important difference in how you reach out to people that can, determine the likelihood of how likely they are to respond. Or, and find out who you know that knows the person who you want to connect with. Often I'll have people reach out to me and say, I know that so and so is doing this thing in education. Could you talk to them? Look at their CV. So things like that. I mean, don't hesitate. Don't be shy about it. I know, at least for me, it was there was a lot of insecurity in the beginning, of your career. I applied to many jobs, which I, on paper, would have been perfect for, I think, but didn't get any response sometimes, and that can make you feel like, oh my gosh, is it me? Am I doing something wrong? I mean, the truth is, like, you you never know what's going on in the background. There are lots of very busy people trying to make decisions quickly, and so don't take that personally, but do persist, and have confidence in what you can offer.
Yeah, then
Excellent.
I would quickly add there. I absolutely agree to Saamira, of course, the conferences that they may be a good way. So usually there are cheaper prices also for attendance of students in such of educational conferences, and maybe you start in your country or region and don't need to go overseas for that necessarily. For us, one point also where people come in, but that of course only works here locally. Basically, often organizations maybe need student assistants or some kind of temporary jobs where you can have a look. And if you're close to such an organization, so that you have a chance coming in into that. And maybe also some of your former classmates also might have some contacts. So at the beginning, of course, it's a little bit difficult to start the network. When it just started and you have a person here or there, it may go on. But so that is also what I would suggest. Or directly, as Saamira said, to approach organizations for questions or offer help or ask for internships. So for us, for example, there is no official how to say program for these kind of things, but sometimes there are possibilities. So I mean, 90% probably that would be no, because it doesn't fit in or whatever, but maybe you're 10%, and that's exactly the moment where some help or some research project is started, and oh wow, cool, somebody having knowledge in that area that fits. So these are probably moments to, or possibilities to get in, I would say.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Yeah, Leela.
Yeah, so nowadays there are so many webinars, virtual sessions by different organizations, like in case of USAID. We conduct virtual session webinars on different topics. And sometimes when we launch our new strategy or policy, and so is with the other organizations. So that's also a good time to connect virtually, ask questions, and to learn about the new directions of the organizations. That helps a lot for the networking. Over.
Excellent. So thanks everybody for sharing a little bit about networking. I've added a couple of other opportunities, and I saw Ania added CIS in there. Our next question is from Adriana, and all of you are either based in kind of a regional or an international organization, and many of you talked about focusing on localization and development projects. And so Adriana's wondering about, this seems like a multitasking occupation. Adriana, you want to come in since you just jumped on and clarify your question a little more?
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, what are some of the challenges you may face working in your field? Because is obviously you don't just focus on one project or program, and obviously collaborating with other kind of civil societies and other NGOs is like, it does sound like you have to juggle a lot at once. So I was thinking, like, what are some of the challenges and how you would overcome these challenges and barriers in order to kind of provide the best kind of surface or advice, if that makes sense.
I can try to answer that. There is a lot of multitasking in my job. And I think what I have learned is that, you know, when I interview people who are interested in working in my department, I always ask that question: are you a person who likes to just focus on one thing at a time, or do you enjoy when you have a lot of things going on? And in my experience, typically, if people say they're really like to have more than one project, work on one project, it works out fine. But I think some people also struggle with that. So I think it's important to kind of know what you thrive doing. And we do have a lot of analysts on our team, for example. They really like their focus time when they just can spend one day on one research project. But in my job as like a M&E backstop of projects in the field, that almost never happens. Like I constantly have emails from different projects. I have to switch from education to civil society. But that's what keeps me interested in the job. And I have been with my organization for over 10 years. And I can say I'm never bored just because of that. There's just so much going on. And I learned so much from that interaction. But it is definitely not something that works out for everyone. And I can see how, you know, it can be challenging. And you can, you know, if you still enjoy it but have challenges with that kind of style of work, you can also use some management tools, and a lot of my colleagues do that. They have there are some online management tools that people use. We have ClickUp on one of the projects that we have, because there's so much going on, it's hard to keep up. So, you know, you just have to kind of figure out what works for you and if this is something that you like, but also there are some tools that you can use to help yourself.
Excellent. Thanks, Ania. Oliver, I think you're next, and then Margaret.
Was I next, or yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Good. Yeah, I of course agree to that. It also, I think it takes a bit of time to find out the right balance there. So, I mean, when I started, and probably it's for a lot of persons, then you may have, I don't know, in other areas may be different, but it is my area, it was restricted to a certain extent because you only can help in some areas, and that's still fine. But then, of course, soon you get more experience. You get another project, you have to manage different areas of the projects because you know more, and then the thing becomes complex. I, in a way, agree also that you can learn that, and it's interesting. I mean, yes, it kept me busy at one time, but it was also very interesting, and I learned a lot. But I just told you that for me now, after 25 years, basically in that organization, took a decision to reduce that a little bit. So it was not only different projects, but different work in general, the management work, recruitment process at the same time, alarm fires here and there. And at a certain time I say, okay, I don't want that for me anymore. Okay, that's now a different phase, not at the beginning. There probably you cannot just say, sorry guys. And I think I'm in a way still multitasking to a certain extent, but of course you also see, or I saw at least, that I cannot do the quality at all that I want to deliver in all these kind of threats. And there are people relatively, very much different. I know people who only can work on one project because they want to deliver 100% quality, which anyway in most areas is not possible because there's no time and no money for these kind of things. But some projects maybe can do that, but it simply needs a time. And I don't know whether your question also was a little bit more in relation not only to the self-management, but also with the partners. And yes, there are a lot of challenges in working with low and middle income countries and those of organizations, in terms of timelines that change all over, in terms of responsible people that changes on the other end suddenly. So in a lot of these countries, after half a year, the positions are changed, the government has changed or whatever, and your project basically is dead if you cannot re-identify the people who did it before, or if you cannot assure are handing over. And so even for that purpose, you partly need to work on different projects at the same time, simply because it may happen that otherwise suddenly there's a complete lag phase or so. And it's really a little bit of juggling around to put that all in place, maybe with help of the management tools that were already mentioned. Thank you.
All right. I want to get to Margaret. Thanks, Sarah, for joining. So Margaret, over to you. And then we'll have one last question and wrap things up. So go for it.
Thanks, Will. And I agree with Oliver and Ania. I think flexibility is a very useful tool in the work that we do. And it's always good to hear that, you're not alone. I remember sometimes I'm interacting with some colleagues and everyone is always talking about how overwhelmed they are, always, and it never stops, And I think, and in most instances, no one is even overworking you. You find yourself overworking yourself. But I think what I'd like to add to what Oliver and Ania said is well-being practice is very important. And because, the work that we work is just, there's that noble bit of it. It's for the society's well-being. You're contributing to something bigger than just, selling something and then getting people to buy it. And so well-being practice, just figuring out how do you balance your work-life balance, actually, whether even in between the work. And then there are all these courses now. There are people who are actually experts on this kind of thing, and they'll teach you how to identify some of the things that work to help, you become the best version of yourself by balancing your professional life and your personal life as well, and making sure that you maintain that balance so that you don't find yourself breaking. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Margaret. Some good advice on self-care. I want to ask one question specifically, and then I'm going to give kind of the panelists the time for their last bits of wisdom. So everybody's talked a little bit about the importance of communication. And Sam, I think your point might be a little bit hard for some of us to hear that are working on PhDs or masters, that, okay, what we're working on here in academic publications and production may not be what is important when we get into some of these organizations as far as how we communicate, how we write, and so forth. So for those of us that are, being trained to do dissertations or academic publications, what other advice do you have on, like, what other types of writing should we be practicing? What other skills should we be gaining? And how do we do some of that?
I assume you want me to answer that?
Yeah, please.
I think, one exercise that I did, I think in my master's program, was to write a policy brief that was 1,000 words, and it was a very complex topic, and you had to sort of give your summarize it and give your recommendation in 1,000 words. And at that point, I went to like 1,025 or whatever it was. It was over. And then I remember that was, I got points off, right? Like, nope, you dropped a grade because you weren't able to keep it to 1,000 words. So I think practicing conciseness in our communication, whether it's spoken or written, very important. So many of our stakeholders are time poor, right? They're constrained. They don't have time to read the 150-page report that, even the World Bank produces. So the most important piece of that report is the executive summary. those are the core messages that are going to be shared with the highest level decision makers. So those have to be really sharp and catchy. And something that we do in our PhD programs is we qualify everything. You know, where there's a lot of, well, it's not 100%, you know, there's a lot of gray area in social science research, right? But the outcome of that needs to be, okay, so what do I do with this information, right? I mean, the robustness of the evidence is really important. So I'm not suggesting that anything changed in terms of the rigor of the research, but how you translate that into something actionable that, you know, people will find easy to, you know, take action on. I think that's something you have to think about pretty constantly. It's a challenge, right? But exercising that muscle of how can I say this in a way that will be more meaningful to more people that are not specialists in this field.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. All right, so our final question, I'm just going to give every panelist a chance to respond to is, so we have a lot of students joining us today, some kind of towards the end of their master's program, some towards the end of their PhD maybe, and any final bits of wisdom on what maybe they should be focusing on as their next step if they're trying to break into this. So whether that's a skill or experience or, you know, a reflection, sitting here as a student about ready to finish their degree, and they want to be in, let's say, 10 years, or maybe a little more than that, in some of your shoes. What advice do you have for them? Final bits of wisdom. Ania, we're going to start with you.
Let me see. Well, I can say that internships have definitely been a great way for people to kind of try out if a given field is what they are interested in. So even if it's like a short-term thing, I think it's worth kind of trying if you're a good fit for a given organization and for the type of work, or maybe consultancy also would give you kind of an opportunity to try out things. Just don't be afraid of talking to people. I think sometimes, like when people start, they can be kind of shy or quiet. Just like go out there and ask questions, and don't be afraid to connect people. Once you get within an organization, also try to connect with people working in different fields if this is the type of organization that has a lot of different opportunities, just to kind of see what it is for you that you're interested in. I think it took me a little bit of time to figure it out, but I feel like I found it because I had those opportunities to try out things and not be sort of limited to just one thing, one type of work. So I guess that would be my advice: to be flexible, open, and not be afraid to talk to people and ask questions.
Excellent. Thanks. Margaret, how about your last words of wisdom?
Thanks, Will. I think what I can say is, you know, everyone's journey is different. And even as we were sharing our journey, you know, what works for us may not necessarily work for everyone. But I think the most important thing to remember is doing a job that you love and that you are passionate about makes your life very easy. Rather than being stuck in something that you don't like doing, and you wake up every morning and you just hate going to work. So I think remembering why we go into social work is very important, and then doing what you love. You know, when you self-reflect, you know, what is your calling, what do you want, what kind of change do you want to make, you know, in the world. So I think just to make sure you have a passion for helping others, and just you know, tying to that, the call for change in education is transforming from calling for inclusion to education justice. And justice is such a strong word because, you know, we're moving from saying one group of people have been excluded to saying they deserve justice. And so I think we could definitely use a lot more people in the sector, and I wish you the very best. And maybe, Will, I'm happy also to share my contacts if anyone wants to reach out at some point. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Margaret. Oliver, how about you for your last bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of ideas were already given. I also would agree to Margaret for sure that certain kind of motivation and passion as a starting point, of course, is necessary and absolutely helpful, and will help also with the context and how you react to people. As a practical suggestion, I would come back to the research conferences, if this is at least is an area where results are presented where you're interested in. I think that's a good way of seeing how people work, what is presented, what is the status of the research, of course. And I would also add that there's certain openness or flexibility is very helpful. So maybe at the beginning it's this direction and that is what I burn for, but you may see very soon that it's maybe adjusted a tiny little bit. Let it be simply by the team, and you will learn maybe that also the environment where you're working in is very important, and not only what the company or organization is doing in a way, and that you keep a little bit open and try out different things, and then come further with a career. And don't be too strict at the beginning. It must be exactly that area. At least that is what I detected for myself, where I was thinking it should be biology and a certain area there. Okay, it didn't work out, and I'm really happy in this field. And I never thought that it would be so interesting at the beginning, and all these intercultural work and helping countries or ministries and whatever, how interested and how good feedback you get at a certain moment. So it's really an interesting work. And I was not thinking about this when I was studying biology. So things can change.
Perfect. Thank you. Lila, do you have any final wisdoms to add?
Yeah, thank you. I think whatever is said here is quite relevant and quite applicable to all. Just a couple of points very briefly. One is about like being volunteer in addition to internship. I think it's a good idea to get some job or to some foot in some organizations. And there are the organizations who sometimes seek volunteers professionally. So this is the one thing which can open the door for the new opportunities. And the second thing is like keep an eye about the emerging trends, and sometimes a bulk of funding to go a certain region, certain areas, and there are a lot of projects. So if students are aware of that, they can approach there, and if they are willing to work there. And the third point, which has been emphasized, but I will say again, the good writing skills always give a dividend. I tell you, every employer needs a lot the good writers and good writing skills. I have seen that, and especially those who write very simply and write concisely. So these are the couple of points, and much is already has been said. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. Sam, you want to wrap us up? Your final bits of wisdom?
Sure. I would say that, make your value known. You do have to do a little bit of selling yourself. So identify what it is you're really good at, whether it's, statistical analysis, research skills, teamwork, identify what your strengths are and lead with those, and also show flexibility to learn other things. And that will make it much easier for a hiring manager to see how you can contribute to their team and to their work program. So that would be my advice to people who are stepping into this space.
Perfect. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being able to hang with us for a little bit over today. Want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Really appreciate the time and the advice and suggestions for everybody else who's trying to make a way into this field. So thanks so much for joining us. I also want to appreciate our event planning team led by Adriana today, but also Zhao Misaki kind of working in the background for helping support and put this on. So really appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks so much for hanging with us as we go a little over, and I'm going to stop the recording now and wish you all a great rest of your day, evening, morning. So